Hello and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about open source sustainability for the long haul. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Do we have any lo-fi beats to work and study to? Very excited to talk to our guest today. Before we introduce him, I want to make sure you know who the other voice is on this podcast. At the moment, it's just me, your solo host again, Richard Littauer. Hello, everyone. Great to be here. Happy to be here in somewhat muggy Vermont, which is cool. And I'm joined by the illustrious and wonderful Simon Vansintjan, who I normally know as Simon Vansintjan because I'm an Anglophone. Simon is joining us today from what sounds like his couch in his apartment in Washington, D.C. Simon, how are you?
I'm pretty good. Nice to be here. The weather here is also muggy, so not just a Vermont thing.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. That's how that goes. Simon and I have a lot of experience of that. This is one of the few podcasts where I've just invited on a long-standing friend of mine. Simon and I met at the University of Edinburgh decades ago. Gosh, that's scary. In Scotland. But since then, he's gone on to have a long and pretty cool career. He did a lot of design stuff along the way. He became a coder. For a long time, he's worked with the UN. And right now, he's doing something else that I thought was worth bringing on this podcast. What is it? Well, it's Mirlo, which I hope I've pronounced correctly. Simon, what's Mirlo?
Mirlo is basically an online record store. It's a way for you to buy digital music directly from musicians, as well as to throw them a couple of bucks a month. As a comparison, in non-open source software, I would say basically if you took Bandcamp and Patreon and you put them together in an app, that would be the equivalent. On the pronunciation, we have all been calling it Mirlo, like the wine. But apparently, because it is based on the Spanish word for blackbird, it is Mirlo. So we're wrong, but we're staying with the pronunciation.
But no longer. Mirlo sounds excellent. I'm going to call it that from now on in my head. Thank you for that. That's great. So it's Bandcamp plus Patreon. It's a way of paying artists directly. Now, that's cool. Is it open source? And if so, what's the stack you're building it on?
It is open source. It is, I think I'd have to double check this, but HEPL version 3. I did that blindly. I don't know all the implications of that. I know it is just very restrictive of who can reuse the code. And also, a lot of the code was taken from another open source project, Resonate. So the stack is basically full stack TypeScript or JavaScript. It uses Express on the back end with Redis, Postgres, and all those other things. And then React on the front end.
Cool. Okay, so it's an open source project that you've been working on with some other people. Tell me a bit about how it started.
I was working on Resonate about a year and a half ago at this point, when there were some issues with the way that the code on Resonate works. It was very legacy. There was a lot of things that were old and hard to manage, as well as from having many conversations in the space, there was a good community at Resonate. We realized that streaming software like Spotify, which is what Resonate is trying to be, cannot actually run without venture capital money. So we're looking at other business models, one of them being more like Bandcamp or Patreon, both of which are profit-making businesses. Spotify still is not. So we thought we would try a different product that looked at what works for Resonate, what worked for Ampled, which also was a similar project, and to go from there.
That's actually shocking to me. Spotify isn't making money yet?
Not as of a year and a half ago. I feel like it's kind of similar. I was going to say Uber didn't make money, but Uber started making money in 2021 or something like that. But yeah, Spotify doesn't actually make money. They run off of investments, basically. The company is not profitable, which is why you see them doing stuff like podcasts, because it reduces the amount of time that people are listening to royalty paying music, the way that royalties break down, essentially.
Interesting. I know we've had someone from Spotify on before. We've had Per Plug, who was at FOSS Backstage in Berlin, talking about the Spotify FOSS Fund, which is really cool. It's an OSPO he was running there. I don't think he's there anymore. I think he's moved on somewhere else. That's episode 129 if you wanted to check. But yeah, that's just really interesting. I'm looking at resonate.coop, which I'm assuming is the same Resonate you're talking about. So this is a music platform we can all control. No, really. And it's a community-owned music streaming service. Tell me about why it's a co-op.
So a lot of us working on Mirlo come from the solidarity economy space, which is a space that focuses on building worker power and building spaces, whether housing or just like mutual aid groups or businesses that are usually non-hierarchical, where everyone is empowered to make decisions. But basically this like idea of the people who are building the thing are in control of the thing, whether that's a coffee shop or otherwise. So that's kind of what we value, the ability for everyone to feel like they're empowered. What's different with Mirlo from Resonate was that Resonate was a multi-stakeholder co-op, whereas Mirlo is just a worker co-op. And a multi-stakeholder co-op means that you have a board which has representation from the people who use the service, like listeners, the people who produce for the service, so musicians, and the people who make the service, workers. So all those people would have an equal amount of seats on the board, and they make decisions about the direction of the service together. Mirlo is not doing that, mainly because we have a blog post on our website going into this, but there is a lot of work that goes into maintaining that kind of space that falls on the workers. But while that is the case, we are hoping that we will eventually exit to community, which I think is a familiar term in your space, where we will open up our co-owner community to the wider community.
Thanks for sharing that blog post. That'll be online on the show notes. This is really interesting to me because co-ops are another fun way of making a business. Do you know what tax designation that is under the IRS?
So yeah, we're just an LLC.
Oh.
When you file for an LLC, depending on how you're doing it, but you'll get operating agreements for an LLC. And we're still writing ours, but in your operating agreements, you can do, for an LLC specifically, you have a lot more constraints with like a not-for-profit 501c3 situation. But for an LLC, you can pretty much organize your thing however you want. So we formed an LLC based on advice from our lawyer, and we're still writing our operating agreements. And those will sketch out the co-op structure.
Tell me about how many other people are involved with Mirlo.
So our co-owners, the people on the legal paperwork, are Jody and Alex. Jody's in New York and Alex is in Massachusetts. Jody met us through our work at Resonate. So Jody is in New York and Jody takes care of a lot of our cultural work. Right now, that looks a lot like social media, but it also means that they're going to shows in New York or interacting with our musicians in New York or interacting with creative spaces in New York to build community and to integrate with the community there. Alex and I met a while ago. Alex was one of the last musician owners of Ampled. Ampled was another attempt at a music support co-op. Alex and I met through various online activism spaces. And Alex is very much about that cooperative mentality where he can get into the nitty-gritty of the governance.
So I'm thinking about this in terms of other open source projects. Obviously, you have a technical side of the platform and that has to be maintained, it has to be built, but you also have people who are buying into the platform by using it. And so, artists, people who are actually making music are going to be using the platform and hopefully giving some money back to you. What's your sustainability model for your code base?
One of the reasons that we went with the Bandcamp/Patreon model was that we did the math. We take a slice off of every single purchase. Say they sell something for $1 on Mirlo, we get 7 cents of that. To actually make that an amount of money that makes sense at scale, we would have to have hundreds of thousands of dollars moving through the platform. We won't get there for a while, probably. But because we're also this patronage site, we are able to get people to directly support us. We're dog fooding the website itself. We have a team page and people can pledge a contribution to Mirlo, a monthly contribution to Mirlo. That way, right now, we have $295 coming in, which covers our server costs. It does not do much else but cover our server costs. It does not pay for any labor, etc. So while we hope that that number will obviously increase as the service becomes more popular, as more people get faith in it, we also want to guarantee that we are able to continue working on it, which means finding some other form of money. We're applying to grants. which is kind of a tricky space to be in because there aren't that many grants for businesses of this type. Usually it's for not-for-profits if you're in the art space and stuff like that. But we're also doing a Kickstarter. We're hoping to raise $15,000 and go from there.
What stopped you from being a nonprofit to begin with?
The pain in the butt of being a nonprofit.
Fair enough.
Yeah. We have schemes, right? There is actually lots of ideas about how we can sustain this. One of the main things we want to work on is redistributing money. And one of the ways to do that is set up a not-for-profit so that we can get philanthropy money. So we can get that into the hands of our worker owners, but also into the musicians through mini grants or whatever that we. So this is an idea that we have, but we were like, what's the easiest thing to do right now is to set up an LLC, and then we can go from there.
So I'm still unclear about this. What separates the artists from also being worker owners? Aren't they doing art? Aren't they working? Like, isn't that a profession as well?
It is. It is 100% a profession. And that is something that we're working on in our operating agreements. Different co-ops have gone about this different ways. At Ampold, there was a threshold for if you had 10 people who supported you via Ampold, you became a artist owner. At Resonate, there was no threshold. It was basically if you had uploaded music to Resonate, you became an artist owner. At artisans.coop, it's a point system, and all work at artisans.coop counts as a certain amount of like contribution to the thing. And if you meet a threshold, you become a worker owner. So we very much know that musicians who contribute music and like put their faith in their platform are contributing work to Mirlo as well, because they are doing the labor, but they are also already doing that labor, and Mirlo is a way of distributing a thing. So this is something we have to figure out. I mean, this is the part of where we're going to do the exit to community part. We will be bringing, musicians into the decision-making process. At the same time, the people who are contributing to our project, we have our 3 co-owners, but we also have a group of volunteers who, for a variety of reasons, are not yet co-owners, might become in the future, are also musicians. Alex is a trombonist. I just had a show on Saturday that I'm still sick from, but we also have people who make all of their money, their livelihood from music. We have hobbyists and people who are like full-time musicians, and it's tricky. It's definitely not a solved problem. So that's kind of like why we're experimenting.
So when I think about workers who are actually working on the product itself, obviously, there's people who are going out and co-owning it and doing the finances. That's definitely labor. That's very annoying. No one does that stuff for free if they can help it. But then there's, of course, code, right? This is a platform that runs on the internet. We talked about it Stack. We talked about the fact that it's an open source project. Talk to me about Chicken Soup with Rice. So this is someone who has contributed once to the GitHub code base. You have 11 contributors.
Oh my gosh.
And Chicken Soup with Rice added 25 lines, removed 1. But Louise K had 330 commits with around 10,000 lines added and 5,000 removed. Do they have an equal share as worker owners?
Neither of them are actually worker owners. The reason LLK, Louise K, is not a worker owner is, and this is the intricacies of tax law, we don't make any money. And if LLK, who has been with the project from the beginning, were to be a co-owner of Mirlo, he would have to file taxes in the US, and despite the fact that he doesn't. And so LLK opted not to do that. There is a lot of questions that we have about how we're going to start the track for membership into the cooperative as co-workers. And this is very tricky. Like, this is honestly, we've had people contributing great code like LLK, or Fenny Firth has been James Fern, I think, has been contributing too recently a lot, done major changes, but we don't yet have a like set track to co-ownership, which will be defined by the operating agreement once we have that finished. So we're like very early stages in that process. But the idea is that we'll start asking probably how much time people are contributing, and then keeping track of that to see within the past 6 months who has contributed X amount of time. At the same time, we do care about diversity in our co-op. And if we just accept everyone to be co-owners and we're not able to compensate people, then that will look like a very white male audience, as it currently does. So that is something that we're also trying to keep in mind when we're talking about who co-owners are Mirlo. and what that looks like as we work towards bringing a very diverse community in. That's one of the explicit stretch goals of our Kickstarter, is to be able to kind of go into spaces and bring people in from other spaces to have them have a like more deliberate say, and also be able to compensate people for that say while they're, contributing at least their input or their ideas to the platform.
So it's interesting to me that the two people I brought up at random, there are other people like James Fenn, like you, who you mentioned, aren't owner workers yet. So this is the term you've been throwing out. It's fun for me to see all the edge cases that you have.
Mm-hmm.
I think
it's difficult for sure. There's so much. I mean, it's not even nuance. It's just like you have to draw lines, right? And it's not easy to decide where to draw those lines or to give people the option. It could be that if we were to reach out to some of those people, they'd be like, actually, no, I'd rather not take that responsibility. Yeah, it's just taking a lot longer than we thought to actually get to that decision-making point. There's a lot of uncertainty for sure.
Well, my question was actually me just pointing out that this sounds really difficult. What sort of structures do you have in place to enable you to have these difficult conversations? Because that strikes me as symptomatic of a large number of open source projects, which have good intentions, good meaning, and they're trying to figure out the things like, how do we exit the community? How do we get this off the ground in terms of accounting? How do we ensure that people from different nationalities are able to pay or not pay, or be paid or not be paid? So what does the process look like for you as someone who's been in the solidarity movement for a long time, as someone who's been involved with social justice movements and cooperatives? How are you working to make sure those conversations are productive and meaningful for everyone involved?
It's slow, basically. It just takes a long time. I think from my experience, a lot of this is based on trust. And it takes a really long time to build trust with people. And it takes a long time to build trust with people up to a level where you don't know if you're going to get compensated, especially if you're also dealing with other constraints of just living under the system that we're living in, where you have to pay rent, you have to buy food, you have to do all these things to just survive. All of that it just takes time. It just takes time to get there. At the same time, we don't have time, right? Like, because as we run out of the pressures of rent, et cetera, build on us, we might lose people who are currently contributing to the project. We could end up in a situation where we are able to run Mirlo based on donations for like years, pays the server costs, but the only people who are able to contribute to it are people who have privilege and spare time to do so. And while that is probably still a net gain, it's not necessarily what we want to do, because we actually want to build a stronger community that is based in like having conversations around who's making decisions and those kind of things. And yeah, time and money.
That answers my question. Yeah.
It's hard.
Focusing on the code base itself as an open source project, just trying to extrapolate based upon this entire idea of working within the music space, which is only one of the many spaces that open source covers. It's like an infinity of spaces. I'm noticing that you don't have any contributing docs, and there's nothing in the README that mentions how you can join. You have a contributing section that says you can run it this way, get Docker up, which is like, great, that's cool. What's your onboarding look like for people who are like, I'm a musician, but besides working with synths, I also code HTML. How can I help out with the website?
Yeah, we have a Discord server, basically, that people use to provide us with feedback. They use it to put ideas in it. And we also use it to help people get started with the project. When people join our Discord server, they can self-assign a developer role for interest in helping with that stuff. And based on that, I will DM them being like, hey, you said you were interested in helping with this. Let me know if you have any problems with getting the project up and running. And so I guess we've offloaded some of the written documentation to a more like one-on-one conversation situation, which will sometimes happen in public or it'll sometimes happen in private messages. We try to have a like generative conversation. And we used to, for a month or two, have bi-weekly developer calls. We used to do this to great success at Resonate. They quickly became like the most active space at Resonate once we started doing those regularly. But this is, again, a capacity issue. I have been the sole developer on the project for a while with help from LLK now. And with the focus on doing a lot more admin things like operating agreements, fundraising, grant applications, Kickstarter stuff, It's just fallen by the wayside. Having said that, we do artist office hours. So you can book office hours as an artist with Jody. And a lot of the folks, we have weekly calls as well, and we have a monthly community call. But yeah, we should have a contributing.md and a code of conduct.
I'm wondering, is there a benefit to you to be open source at all?
Yes, very much so. The code is much better for it. Honestly, there have been people who have pitched in, and while the numbers don't look that significant, they've made a significant change to the code base. I'm not a DevOps person. It feels like staring into a black box for me. And people come in and they have Docker knowledge and they're able to figure out why our sharp NPM package is not updating. And I'm like, thank God, because that would have been a problem for me in 5 years. And they fixed it. Yeah, it's just been amazing how much people are willing to contribute and go the lengths they're willing to go to for a project like this. Also, frankly, I think it generates trust, which I think is important, especially when you're competing with millions of venture capital money.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what's the competitive space for Mirlo? I know that Bandcamp was sold from Epic Games to SongTrader, who then laid off half of its workforce. You said that Spotify isn't making a ton of money, and they've also had their own ups and downs over the years. Why this project versus other projects? Why not just have a Patreon and just put your albums up on Patreon? The system's already there for that.
Yeah. I mean, there is a moral element to that question for sure. And it's not always the most convenient. Like, we're fairly close, minus bugs, etc. We're fairly close to feature parity with Bandcamp, which I think is amazing. There's a lot of things we're missing. But as far as like the things that I think 80% of musicians use, we're there. What we don't do is merch, and we don't do label support. But what we're noticing is that people care about being a co-op, and people care about it being open source. And this is a big question, right? Like, the question is like, what are you trying to do? And it could be that we're trying to compete with Bandcamp, or that we're trying to compete with Spotify, or that we're trying to compete with Patreon. But personally, while it would be cool to like create a co-op that is able to compete with these people on the footings of, they had millions of dollars injected into them, I'm not actually sure that's the internet that I want. And that's part of why Mirlo is open source as well. We have the ambition of integrating with ActivityPub to be able to be part of the Fediverse. There's other groups as well, right? So there's Jam.coop is building a service that's fairly similar to Mirlo. Patron Tape is a streaming service. Tone Audio is also a streaming service. Ampwall is doing a merch store. And these, none of us, and I think a majority of them, don't see each other as, and I have to also mention Faircamp, which is a self-install static website thing. We're not competing with these groups. We're hoping to build an internet that is diverse and that has standards. And we get there by talking to people, and we get there by being open, and we get there being transparent in our intentions. And so that is all part of it. And yes, it appeals to a narrower demographic that will likely be our space. But we hope that by bringing in other people through the culture work that we're doing, we will be opening that space as well. And that's about user experience. That's about accessibility. That's about those kind of things.
So you mentioned to me yesterday that you might have to print like 200 shirts. So tell me how you're not doing merch when you're also doing a Kickstarter. What's that about?
Yeah, so we're doing a Kickstarter. And as part of the Kickstarter, usually you have reward tiers where people essentially commit to buying one of your products. Mirlo is already built. It's up and running. 200 artists use it. We have about $500 a month moving through the platform. So it's there. We don't really have a very concrete, like, for our initial thing, like, we're basically just trying to meet the calculation that we did was to the end of 2024 of operating costs, which includes travel, etc. But we want to give some people some things for their time. The first tier is compilation album, which I think is the most on-brand thing that we'll do. But also, I do screen printing for my mutual aid group. I do button making, and those were just things that we were like, well, we'll throw those in as well. We'll just make a cute design or something like that, or just a logo on a t-shirt, and we'll make those. It would make a lot of sense for us to implement the merch features that we have threatened to implement on our website so that we can sell this merch that we're making for Mirlo on our website. And musicians could also sell actual records and t-shirts and stuff like that to fans, which is a great way for people to make money currently in the creator economy.
Well, that sounds great. When does your Kickstarter end?
The Kickstarter ends June 2nd, which is this weekend.
That is exciting and cool. I hope that it goes really well. I really like talking about this. I think it's different than our normal guests who are talking about systemic things with the ecosystem at large, but oftentimes open source projects are just people trying to scrape by and figure out how to get a cool product out there. And it's cool that you're being so intentional with being a cooperative and that you're thinking of ways to make sure that the code itself works and that you have enough to keep the lights on while you continue to grow and move in such a huge space. That is awesome. So anything you feel like we didn't mention that we should mention?
Go check out Mirlo. Honestly, there's already a lot of music on there that I've bought because I liked listening to it. So yeah.
That's Mirlo, and it's mirlo.space online, which is super, super cool. You can also check that from our show notes at podcast.sustainoss.org. And Simon, talk to me a bit about where we can find you on the internet. Do you write stuff? Do you have social media? Where can people follow you and learn more about the work you do?
I have very little public internet presence. The only place right now I sometimes post something from, aside from the Mirlo accounts, is Simon at social.coop on Mastodon.
Awesome. And that'll also be in the show notes. You can follow along with this cool open source project. Simon, thank you so much for coming on. It's meant a lot. It's really cool to see that this work is going and blooming and that you're already covering most of the infrastructure costs and that there's money on the platform. That is awesome. Good luck with everything. Don't leave yet. However, now we have that part of the show called Spotlight, where we highlight people, projects, things, books, dog toys, whatever, that we feel like just need a little bit more light shed on them. Traditionally, the host goes first. So that's me. I think my spotlight today is going to be Ryo Fukui. I really love Ryo Fukui. He's a fantastic jazz musician from Japan. He had an album come out in 2016, but I feel like he actually was only active in the 70s and maybe gone now in one of those amazing searching for Sugar Man type things. But you should definitely check out Serenity, the 1976 album that he is on. That's Ryo Fukui. It's just one of my favorite jazz albums that I love to listen to, along with Uyama, Hiroto, and Nujabe. So there's a whole ton of awesome jazz coming out of Japan. But that's just one album to point out today. And Simon, what is your spotlight?
I'll stay on the jazz theme for our Mirlo community. We did a book club, and it's about the book Noise Uprising, which focuses on the 20s and 30s, basically global spread of jazz. And it's just like a really great material look at what that meant, what it meant like physically in the records that were being distributed and how they were being recorded, as well as just the people who were making music. And it's really cool to read. Besides that book, Noise Upreading, and it's by Mike Deming.
That is cool. If you could throw a link in the chat, we'll put it in the show notes as well. Super awesome. And with that, if you have any favorite jazz albums that you like, listeners, you can always let me know. You can email us at podcast@sustainoss.org if you have any feedback whatsoever. Please rate us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, whatever it's on. You can follow us on Mastodon at SustainOSS, also on Blue Sky and LinkedIn. Join our discourse.sustainoss.org. And you can always find more episodes and show notes at podcast.sustainoss.org. And finally, because we also like to sustain ourselves, you can donate by going to opencollective.com/sustainoss. And we would appreciate that as well, because just like any podcast or music, this is not produced for free. Simon, thank you so much for coming on today. It was really cool to talk about Mirlo and talk about your work in general. I'm going to keep pronouncing it that way for the rest of the time, even though I have a really bad Spanish accent, and you're just going to have to live with it. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Richard. It's been great to talk with you and been cool talking to you, seeing what you do.
This is me, for better or worse. All right. Thanks, everyone.